Hi everyone, and welcome back to Field Observations with Torniamo, me. This is going to be an interesting one because lately death has been on my mind. Not in a dark way, but in more that sort of curious, contemplative way that comes when life feels especially fragile. I suspect most people don't enjoy thinking about death, about their mortality. I'm not entirely sure why, but recently I have been drawn into to reflect on death, both metaphorically and also literally. And in this sort of short podcast essay, I'm going to explore both a bit, moving through the tarot, cultural practices, and also more personal experiences. I think at the heart of all of this lies a simple yet profound question. How do we live fully knowing that everything eventually ends? And how should we relate to death in our everyday lives? So, in the more metaphorical deaths, perhaps you could say, although I guess in some ways they might also feel literal. So, in the tarot, you have the death card, right? A symbol of letting go of the past and being reborn. It sits nicely between the Hanged Man and Temperance, two other cards in the tarot. The Hanged Man asks us to surrender, whilst Temperance invites us to create a sense of balance. And I suppose, and I guess, in death, we must surrender, both in a literal and metaphorical sense, right? We have to stop holding on. And through that surrendering, that cycle of rebirth and death happens again. And hopefully, by embracing that new sense, or embracing that death, I suppose, we find a new sense of balance and renewed purpose. At least that's what I kind of hope for myself, I guess. I sense that we have to invite this into our life as often as we can, this cycle of death and rebirth, so that we are continuously expanding, growing, even if it is in a direction that we might not have expected it to be. You know, as we move through life, we will experience countless small deaths and rebirths. I've gone through several myself, and this is just a short list. You know, I was made redundant from my corporate job. I moved to the UK in 2012. And in a very smaller sense, but it still was important to me, I sprained both of my ankles once, and I had to entirely and completely change my exercise routine. I used to be an avid CrossFitter, and I just can't take it anymore. And you know, these things are perhaps small, even so, but they're still meaningful, right? And these are sort of the more everyday deaths that I talk about. At the same time as my redundancy, my grandmother passed away, someone who I cherished very deeply. And at the same time, I also became seriously ill with COVID. And I suppose what that time taught me is that we never truly know what's around the corner. It was a 3-in-1. We can have the best laid plans, but everything can change in the blink of a moment. And I think going back to surrendering, that was a real moment of surrendering to me. And at the time, I just kept on pulling the Fool card, right? And the Fool card within the tarot deck symbolizes a new beginning. It might have some risk involved. It might have some naivete involved, but it is the first card of the tarot. You kind of just have to step into this new beginning. And so I did. And that's also when I decided to become a full-time practitioner. It's interesting with cultures as well, right? So I am Norwegian. I suppose, we have a clear sort of separation of church and state. I was still baptized, confirmation, but my family weren't particularly Christian. I suppose we are sort of Protestant, which is a very soft Christianity in many ways, at least in Norway. But at the same time, the Day of the Dead is coming up, and the culture around that is much more distinct and colorful, and there is traditions and practices that are much more elaborate, and I love that. I think that's really interesting because in Norway, we're just super stoic. You are buried, remembered, and that's it. And so yeah, it's just interesting also to think about how death is handled or processed throughout the world. Another way to look at it, of course, is also, in Buddhism, there's a long tradition of a word I am now going to butcher, which is called Maransati. Maransati, meditations on death. They are intended to remind us of the impermanence of life, which is very, very important. Because at the end of the day, everything is temporary, and also everything comes to an end. And I think in the more literal sense of death, I've been also, I suppose, sort of made to contemplate this. A few very important people in my life are growing older. Both my parents are quite ill, although they're still young. Not long ago, two people I knew died in the Air India flight that crashed, both in their 40s. This week, I've been listening to the audiobook of When Breath Becomes Air, which is a memoir by Paul Kalanithi, a neurosurgeon who died from metastatic lung cancer just at 37. He was only 3 years older than I am now. He was on track to become most of the brilliant neurosurgeons of his generations. And so, it's so interesting to think about that somebody who was on track to do some brilliant work and to save many lives in the end was taken from us at such a young age. And this kind of brings me back to that question of how do we live when we know that everything comes to an end? And these kind of reflections can send our minds in very many different directions. It's like, what is the point if we can die at any moment? Should we live each day as if it was our last? Should we give ourselves and others more grace and compassion? Should we even bother fighting for justice or caring when somebody mistreats us? And in so many ways, for me, the answer to all of it is yes. Yes, birth and death are the only certainties in life, but it's the middle part that matters the most, right? And in so many ways, perhaps death isn't the end at all, but a quiet reminder to live whilst we are here. An invitation to forgive faster, to love deeper, and to even let go more easily. I know that's much easier said than done. Certain circumstances has left my mind in some negative mind loops recently, and I've had to be very conscious and aware and mindful of that. But I do think that, keeping our mortality in mind hopefully soften the harder edges of life. I hope that it helps me and you to release some of the trivialities that really doesn't matter. The small grudges, the petty frustrations, the moments when our egos get their knickers in a real twist. And I suppose that might even have happened to me recently, but more on that in a moment around boundaries. And I'm going to do a real segue now from talking about our ego to death, spirituality, and reincarnation. But I think it's a nice development because it kind of expands it from our daily life into who knows what happens after death. I've always been drawn to the idea of reincarnation. It's something that my spiritual teacher also has been speaking to me about. The sense of that life always continues in one form or another. I feel that each life is a spiritual lesson for our divine self. To what end? I don't know. But if each life is a lesson, then perhaps every ending, every small death, is simply our spirit changing classrooms. Some traditions believe in like sin and punishment and so on and so forth. I don't really believe in that. I just believe that we move through experiences to learn. Some lives might be rough, others will be gentle, and that's all a part of our learning queue, each classroom, and learning experiences. Do we get to choose our life before we come here? I doubt it. I think that I think it's almost like an algorithm in the sense of that, oh, you've done this life, then this is what's coming next. That's my sense of it. I don't think there's like a selection of catalogs. Some of it will be, because who would sort of choose the Primark catalog over the Vogue catalog? I just don't think that's how it all works. But yet again, this is so unprovable that we don't know. But I do think that, I suppose it kind of builds a philosophy in our mind, is that it's not that I chose to come here living this specific life, but this is where I was at in my learning queue. And I have to accept the cards that I have been given, and that each life in its own way is a gift, because that's what I do feel. I do feel the spirit really wants to come to the earthly realm and go through this experience. And that gives me hope. And then to just bring everything to a close. We have to live. And to live, we have to find balance. Should we think about death every day? Probably not. Should we remind ourselves of it quite regularly? Absolutely. I think that contemplating the transience of our existence allows us to treasure what truly matters and let go of what doesn't. It can help us to set clearer and healthy boundaries, because when we understand how short life really is, we naturally become more discerning about what we welcome into it. And I think that's so key. So just to finally say, tell people when you love them. Let go when you can. Forgive faster. Because in the end, the only one who loses by holding on is you. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that you found these musings interesting. Hit that like button, subscribe, share, comment, and I'll see you back here next time. Thank you so much for listening.